The question is, how did segregation change America? And why do its effects still be felt today? The past of segregation in the United States is one of struggle, strength, and the fight for equality. It can be seen in everything from schools and buses to laws and everyday life. But what were the most important events in this dark chapter? How did they change the country we live in now? Come with us as we look into the deeply disturbing and often shocking history of segregation. You will never look at American history the same way again. Requiring separate housing, schooling, and other services for persons of color is known as segregation. Because some people in 19th and 20th century America thought that black and white people couldn't live together, segregation was passed into law multiple times. Abolitionists debated what should happen to enslaved persons when they were set free prior to the 13th Amendment's freedom of slaves. One faction promoted colonization, either by establishing their own nation or by sending the former slaves back to Africa. In an effort to facilitate colonization, President Abraham Lincoln recognized the former slave nations of Haiti and Liberia in 1862. Congress provided $600,000 in support of this recognition. The nation instead embarked on a road of constitutionally imposed segregation once the colonization scheme failed. Jim Crow and Black Codes. Black Codes were the first governmental measures towards segregation. Beginning around 1865, these regulations were enacted all over the South, dictating most areas of black people's life, including where they could live and work. Following the abolition of slavery, the rules also guaranteed the availability of black labor at low cost. Soon after, segregation was made official and was upheld by numerous Southern legislation. Lawmakers enacted Jim Crow laws, which were named after a pejorative phrase used to refer to black people, which segregated public spaces, theaters, swimming pools, cemeteries, asylums, jails, and residential dwellings. Professional offices had separate waiting areas for whites and blacks, and Oklahoma was the first state to segregate public phone booths in 1915. In order to make up for the segregation of colleges, independent black universities, such as Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and Howard University in Washington, D.C., were established. The Hampton Institute in Virginia was founded in 1869 as a school for African American youngsters, but its white teachers taught the students how to put black people in service roles for white people. The Supreme Court and racial disparities. A civil rights bill that forbade discrimination in public accommodations, places of worship, and schools was passed in 1875 by the House and Senate, which were then under Republican control. However, the bill was seldom ever put into effect before the Supreme Court struck it down in 1883. In Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court declared in 1896 that segregation was constitutional. The concept of separate but equal was created by the verdict. The case was a man of mixed race who was compelled by Louisiana's Separate Car Act to seat in the train car intended for black passengers. Segregation in housing. Certain communities implemented zoning regulations during the segregation movement, making it illegal for black families to relocate onto blocks with a predominance of white residents. The 1917 Buchanan v. Worley case resulted in the Supreme Court ruling that this type of zoning was illegal due to its interference with property rights of the owners. In an attempt to target black people, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover established a federal zoning committee in the 1920s and used legal loopholes to convince local boards to enact laws prohibiting lower-class families from relocating into middle-class communities. People were forbidden from relocating to any block in Richmond, Virginia, where they could not lawfully with the majority of the locals. This was not technically in violation of the Supreme Court's ruling, but it did invoke Virginia's anti-mixed race marriage statute. During the Great Migration, segregation. 6 million African Americans left the South between 1916 and 1970 as part of the Great Migration. Many of them relocated to the Northeast, where they reported facing prejudice and segregation like to that which they had encountered in the South. Whites-only signs may still be seen on establishments in the North as late as the 1940s. There were segregated schools and residential areas, and black activists claimed harsh responses even after World War II, when black people tried to relocate into white districts. Victor Hugo Green, a mail carrier in Harlem, came up with the idea for the Green Book, which was originally published in 1936. Like most African Americans in the middle of the 20th century, Green had become tired of the prejudice black people encountered whenever they left their neighborhoods. Traveling fearlessly was made possible for Black Americans thanks to this guide. The first issue was limited to hotels and restaurants in the New York region, but he quickly widened its purview by compiling field reports from other postal carriers and paying readers in cash for information they might provide. The handbook was expanded to cover many forms of transportation. Despite being mainly unknown to white people, it finally sold more than 15,000 copies annually and was extensively utilized by Black tourists and business travelers. Subsequent versions featured suggestions for destinations outside of the U.S., as well as details on air travel and cruise ship trips to the U.S., Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, Africa, and Europe. During the Great Depression, the Public Works Administration concentrated on constructing homes for white families in predominantly white neighborhoods in order to provide housing for the displaced. Black households only own a tiny percentage of the homes that were constructed, and those belonged to segregated Black neighborhoods. The PWA destroyed integrated neighborhoods and replaced them with segregated projects in a number of cities. The policy was justified by the claim that Black families would lower property prices. Redlining is the term for the scheme by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board and the Homeowners Loan Corporation to produce maps with locations indicated that were deemed high-risk mortgage candidates beginning in the 1930s. The hazardous red-marked zones are usually the boundaries of Black neighborhoods. Because most Black people of redlined communities had no access to loans or only highly expensive access to them, this type of mapping concentrated poverty. The 1970s saw the start of the practice's discontinuation. Then, during the housing crisis of 2008, a system of reverse redlining, which gave credit on unjust terms with subprime loans, increased the rate of foreclosure in Black areas. How segregation was enforced by a New Deal housing program. During the 1930s, the FHA declined to provide insurance for homes owned by Black families or to cover homes in white neighborhoods that were too near to Black neighborhoods. Segregation in housing. The Supreme Court decided in 1948 that a Black family could move into their newly acquired house in a peaceful St. Louis neighborhood, even though there was a covenant in place from 1911 that forbade the use of the land by any person not of the Caucasian race. In the Shelley v. Kramer case, lawyers representing the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall, contended that permitting real estate covenants exclusive to white individuals was not only immoral on a moral level, but also a misguided strategic move during the period when the nation was working to advance a cohesive anti-Soviet agenda under President Harry Truman. Civil rights advocates viewed the historic case as a model for beginning to remove the vestiges of federal segregation. Although white-only covenants were declared unenforceable by the Supreme Court, the real estate market was far from equal. Truman proposed the Housing Act of 1949 to address the housing crisis brought on by World War II veterans. The law solely provided housing subsidies to white people, with the caveat that Black families could not buy the homes even when they were put up for sale. White flight from cities was effectively funded by the government as a result of the scheme. Levittown, New York, one of the most infamous white-only communities established by the Housing Act, was established in 1949 and was followed by other Levittowns in various locales. Separation in education. In the 1954 case of Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court declared that the practice of segregating children in public schools was unconstitutional. The lawsuit was initially brought in Topeka, Kansas, following Linda Brown's rejection from the all-white schools there at the age of 7. The Boston Bising Crisis. In 1974, one of the worst anti-integration episodes took place, when Black kids from primarily Roxbury schools were transferred to South Boston schools, and vice versa, as part of a Bising system imposed by the courts to address the city's school segregation issues. Violence broke out in Boston. The elimination of racial balance law, which the state had approved in 1965, had been challenged in court by Irish Catholics. While fighting broke out between police and Southie locals over several days, police shielded the Black kids. Insults from white mobs met the buses, and more violence broke out between Roxbury crowds and Southie residents in retaliation. For several weeks, until the violence stopped, state troopers were called in. What caused desegregation Bising, and was it effective? A decades-long attempt to integrate schools through Bising was frequently met with violent protests after a 1954 court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Separation in the 21st century. Modern times still see segregation. Research indicates that even though integrated schools are widely supported by the public, only 30% of Americans want the federal government to step in and make it mandatory. The word apartheid schools refers to still existing, highly segregated educational institutions, where between 0 and 10% of the student body is white. The phenomenon is a reflection of residential segregation that occurs in towns and communities all over the nation, and is caused by local policies that disproportionately target minorities rather than blatantly discriminatory laws. Want to uncover more untold stories from history? Subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay informed with our latest deep dives into America's past and beyond.